Hello and welcome to today's 5-in-1 Mayaani Talks with me, Mega of Mayaani Jewellery. Now, this is actually part two of a two-part small series exploring Indian jewelry traditions. Now, it's all part of a wider series in which I've explored jewelry traditions across different parts of the world, and each of these parts has had two videos dedicated to exploring the traditions that exist across those particular regions. So, it just so happens today we're looking at Indian jewelry traditions. Now, in part one of this two-part series, I discussed very briefly some of the Indian jewelry traditions which exist across India. Now, I say briefly because even I, despite being Indian myself, was quite shocked at just how intricate and detailed and how rich in story and meaning these traditions actually are. So I sort of felt like I couldn't really capture them all in one video, really, without doing them some kind of dishonoring them or giving them doing some kind of injustice. Essentially, I feel like they need to have their own dedicated space to be explored individually, to be fully appreciated. So I will be coming to you in the future with a video, a series that looks into each of the Indian jewelry traditions by region, so we can focus a bit more. But I simply covered briefly some of the key Indian jewelry traditions which exist across India in part one. And now, today in part two, I welcome us to look at who these jewelry traditions were created for. Now, even that topic is quite heavy, having looked at the five particular Indian jewelry traditions which really call to question who were these traditions created for, and do we still honor the reasons for which they were created, or have we actually moved away from the reasons for which they were created? And how can we look to move back, if you like, without not rejecting the traditions by any means, but if anything, deepening our connection with them? That in itself is also a very heavy topic here. So I look forward to exploring each one of these individually in an upcoming series of short videos with you as well. But for now, let's look at these five and cover what we can without getting too deep, where then it just becomes a little bit much to watch in one video. So starting with number one, which is the Streedhan. Now, Streedhan is a is the gold jewelry that a bride receives on her wedding day from her parents. And Stree means woman, Dhan means wealth or sacred gift. So this gold jewelry is given to an Indian bride by her family on her wedding day to honor her as Ma Lakshmi incarnate. There is actually a dharmic reason behind Streedhan being present. I was not aware of this. I've never heard the term Streedhan before, despite the many Indian weddings I've been to and the Indian community I've been in quite closely through my childhood and growing up. I never heard this term, and I never understood what Streedhan was for either. I knew brides received a lot of gold jewelry on their wedding days, on their wedding day, but I never knew why they received lots of gold jewelry on their wedding day. And for the most part, most people around me just sort of said, "This is just what we give. It's almost compulsory or customary. This is what we do, is give gold jewelry. That's just what we do as Indians." But there's a deeper meaning to it than that. And I think when that detachment took place, when we detached ourselves from why we're actually gifting it in the first place, that in itself made the tradition less connected to us, less aligned, and less meaningful, because essentially we lost the whole reason for which we are actually gifting, which is very powerful and beautiful and spiritual. It's actually rooted in the Vedic scriptures. It's rooted in dharmic beliefs and dharmic wisdom. Um, yes, so that's one thing with Sridhan. It is actually Vedic. It's in the Vedic scriptures, and it's a woman's dharmic right. So much as we see this gold jewelry, and many people, I grew up thinking this too, that the gold jewelry, and I still did until I looked into it, that the gold jewelry a bride receives is very much a financial security for her. Bride's family is giving her this gold to provide her with financial security, so that in her married life, should she ever need to have access to finances for any reason, she has access to this, because her husband's wealth or money, property may not be easily accessible to her, as is often the case and was often the case for many Indian women once they got married. They had no financial power or control over the finances in the household. That lay with their husband, that power lay with their husband. So it's in a sense, Sridhan was a financial security for them. However, it was not. You see, that's not his primary function. That's what I was misled to believe as well. That's what I thought. Not misled intentionally. Many people have become confused over what Streedhan is. It's actually one of the most uh, confused, if you like, or misunderstood Indian jewelry traditions. And that is because not everyone understands the origins of Streedhan. And origins are in a woman's dharmic right, because as a woman becomes an embodiment of Ma Lakshmi, the goddess of beauty, prosperity, and auspiciousness, on her wedding day, and then as she steps into her marital home as still Ma Lakshmi incarnate, this Streedhan is gifted to her to honor her as Ma Lakshmi. It is not, yes, it can be a financial security for a financial source of support for her, but its primary function is not that. Its primary function is honoring her as Mahalakshmi. So when Sridhan is abused in any way, when it's absorbed by a husband's family, when it's controlled by elders, when it's used as leverage, when it's disputed, when it's taken away from the woman in separation, or through when death happens, when she becomes a widow, for example, when any of that takes place, it is essentially an abuse of her Sridhan, which is essentially an adharmic act, because her Sridhan is being given to her as something she's spiritually entitled to, because it is in the Vedas. It says in the Vedas that this is actually to be gifted to her as Mahalakshmi. Because of that, if you are to abuse it in any way, you are essentially not just breaking a social rule and committing a social injustice, you're actually committing an adharmic act, an act against Vedic scriptures. Now, there's a few examples here. In the Puranas and Smritis, it clearly states that Mahalakshmi is Ma Shakti herself, the supreme divine force, the primordial force behind all creation and everything that exists. And any home where women are dishonored, silenced, mistreated becomes hostile to her presence. So essentially, by abusing a woman's Sridhan, you are making your environment hostile to Ma Shakti, Ma Lakshmi, Ma Shakti, which then means that Ma Lakshmi or Ma Shakti leaves the environment that you have now made hostile. She does not tend to become enraged. That's not typically a feature that or a quality of Mahalakshmi, really. She tends to leave. And when she departs, her sister, Alakshmi, who is actually the goddess of poverty and misfortune and sorrow, she actually takes Mahalakshmi's place, basically. Yes, misfortune, poverty, and discord. Her sister Lakshmi is who you essentially invite into your home or space when you commit an act against a woman's Stridhan. A woman's Stridhan is meant to be completely under her control. She chooses how to keep it, how to wear it, how she wants to pass it on. It should be completely her own free will that decides and chooses that, uninfluenced by anybody around her. So another example of a bit of scripture that communicates just how important Stridhan is in Vedic scripture as a woman's dharmic right is Atharva Veda 12.2.31, which states, ensure that these women never weep out of sorrow, keep them free from all diseases, and give them ornaments and jewels to wear. This is why the giving of ornaments and jewels to wear is happening, and let them occupy a foremost position in the house. Now, I'm sure that is very far from the reality many Indian women experience once they become brides and daughters in law. But essentially, when you are mistreated in any way, shape, or form within your marital home, that is a dharmic act. Right, number two, Sola Shingar. Now, the Sola Shingar, we have to question whether we still honor Ma Shakti when we uphold this tradition anymore, because the whole purpose of the Sola Shingar was actually to again adorn Ma Shakti, Ma Lakshmi on a bride's wedding day. The bride received the 16 pieces of adornment that a Hindu wife wears on her wedding day to essentially adorn and honor Mahalakshmi. She is seen as the embodiment of Mahalakshmi, as Mahalakshmi incarnate. So by adorning her with these 16 ornaments, you are adorning Mahalakshmi and honoring her. But it is interesting how this, in some cases, this tradition is now upheld more as a compulsory act, where because brides just wear this is just what they wear, they're supposed to wear this. When that consciousness is taken away, rather than you approaching it from a, well, we are adorning, we are dressing Mahalakshmi, we need to dress her as we would dress Mahalakshmi. When you move away from that to just, well, a bride wears this on her wedding day, so do you want to wear it, do you not want to wear it, let's wear it, because you've lost all meaning essentially of why it is she's wearing this shola shringar in the first place. And once that happens, you have now moved away from the dharmic reason behind which the shola shringar was worn in the first place. And essentially it becomes more about visually just marking a woman as married rather than actually recognizing that what the whole purpose behind this tradition was to adorn Mahalakshmi, basically. Um, so it's important to also mention here that the Shola Shringar is meant to be consciously and freely chosen. So it's not meant to be something that is just kind of forced upon the bride. You wear this because you have to wear this. It should be something that is consciously and freely chosen. That is when it fully honors Mahalakshmi and fulfills the purpose, the dharmic purpose for which that whole tradition came into existence in the first place. So we have to ask ourselves whether we still continue to observe this tradition from a conscious viewpoint, from the viewpoint of adorning Mahalakshmi, or whether for a lot of us we experience this tradition more as this is just what you have to wear as a compulsory act. Number three, looking into widowhood. Now, when it comes to widowhood, many widows, unfortunately, in many communities across India, once widowed, have themselves stripped of everything. They kind of wear this red mark on their forehead, extending into their hairline that gets rubbed out. Bangles get broken. Their jewelry is taken away. Basically, the Mangal Sutra, which is their equivalent of a wedding ring, is taken away. It's only more recently that Indians have been wearing wedding rings as a marker, visual marker, representation of their marriage. Traditionally speaking, women received a Mangal Sutra, and many still do. But yes, the Mangal Sutra is removed, and all color is drained away or taken away from the widowed woman's life. A woman, the weird thing about this is it's a hugely contradictory act, essentially, because there's nothing in the Vedas to say that a widow has to be stripped of all color, has to have her Mangalsutra taken away, has to have a sindoor, as it's called, scrubbed off, and has to have her bangles broken. None of that exists in the Vedic scriptures. That is simply a cultural, societal, um, you know, um, happening, a cultural societal thing that happens that isn't actually rooted in tradition at all. Actually, it's become a tradition because culturally many people do it and have been doing it for a period of time, so it's become a tradition, but it's not actually a tradition rooted anywhere in our spiritual scriptures, because ultimately nothing moves away in the Vedic scriptures from a woman still being the embodiment of Mahalakshmi or Mahashakti on her wedding day. She continues to be the embodiment of Mahalakshmi, Mahashakti, throughout her married life, even if she becomes a widow, because Mahashakti is seen to transcend all of that. She's seen to be above all that. Mahashakti remains energetically powerful, irrespective of what happens in the physical world around us, essentially. So basically, a woman who's become a widow is not any less Mahashakti than she was before she was a widow, because her being Mahashakti, her divine feminine power, is not tied to her husband and whether he's alive or not. It exists within her, irrespective of whether her husband is alive or not, and will continue to be present and alive within her as long as she remains existent. It's basically it is tied to her Atma, which is her eternal self, not her physical self, her eternal self, which I come to understand as her immortal self. So essentially, she never stops becoming, she never stops being Ma Shakti. A woman never stops being Ma Lakshmi, Ma Shakti incarnate, irrespective of the physical circumstances of the physical world around her. She is always Mahalakshmi, Mahashakti incarnate. So to consider her to be auspicious and associated with or an incarnation embodiment of Mahalakshmi throughout her marriage and her wedding, starting with the wedding day, from her wedding day all the way throughout her marriage, and then to suddenly consider her, from being auspicious to becoming widowed and being inauspicious all of a sudden, is not something that makes any sense to me. And it's not something that is scripted either in the Vedas. It is something that's purely come about because of the patriarchal society we live in. It is something that we've been encouraged to adopt and think of as just this is just what happens because it's been happening for too long, but it doesn't make it right. Number four, we're on now. Yes, four, dowry. So again, another area that is largely misunderstood. But when it comes to dowry, in Indian culture, it is dharmic again. The whole idea of giving gifts at a marriage is supposed to be an act of love and sacred entitlement. So that person is entitled to this by their sacred divine right. The bride is entitled to these gifts by her sacred divine right, and the gifts are meant to be given to her freely out of love. purely from a place of love. When that turns into transactional demands, as it has started to happen, not just recently, but as has been happening, when this whole idea arrives of a daughter's weight being or worth being measured in gold or measured in money, when basically the groom's side of the family starts to make demands of certain quantities of gold, certain quantities of money being given to them for the wedding to take place, that is when we have now moved very far away from dharma, and essentially we have committed an adharmic act. Has become adharmic because it was never meant to be transactional. Dowry was never meant to be transactional. It's simply gifts given to the bride freely from a place of love as a um, physical demonstration of her divine feminine power, not from a place of I'll marry your daughter if you give me XYZ amount of gold or XYZ amount of money once I marry her or to marry her. Once it becomes transactional that way, essentially a daughter's worth is being questioned, a family's worth is being questioned, the bride's family, the daughter's family is being questioned, and the daughter is now becoming a burden upon her family. And it was never meant to be that way. That was again something that came to be potentially because of the patriarchal society we happen to live in, but it was not the origin of dowry. The whole idea behind dowry was a dharmic act of selfless giving from a place of love to honor the divine feminine that resides, that is embodied in the bride, and that will then carry forward with her because she is now the divine feminine power incarnate into her marital home. It's meant to be an honor. It's not meant to be something that people use to make themselves financially more secure, which is what it has ended up becoming. Number five, diaspora experience. Now, it's very interesting how this all um, becomes more complicated when you are a diaspora woman. Basically, a woman who is of a particular origin but never really grew up in that community, may have grown up outside of that community. So, for example, British Indian women, South Asian women who've grown up all over the world except for the place from which their ancestors originally come from. It becomes complicated because many of these women, like myself, end up receiving traditions without the full picture or full story of these traditions being passed on to you, without having the full understanding of these traditions and why we uphold them and how we should uphold them, and who they're created to honor. And without all those, but at the same time, being expected to, or being made to feel like we're obligated to, our family expects us to, there's a duty that we have to perform in continue to carry these traditions and passing them on. The whole picture can become very complicated because it can end up being the case that a woman of this nature, a diaspora woman like myself, either A, rejects her traditions because she does not feel like she understands them enough or aligns with them well enough to actually carry them. She doesn't want to keep carrying on things she doesn't understand. Or B, she carries on and continues passing on these traditions without fully ever understanding why she may feel, you may feel a sort of pull towards the traditions and a pull towards wanting to uphold them and wanting to pass them on, but be unable to express that in words because consciously you don't really know why you're upholding them or why you're passing them on because that story was never passed on to you. So you can see how for a diaspora woman there's the added challenge of you feeling a greater weight potentially because you've grown up outside of the community from which your ancestors come from. Because you've grown up, there's almost this feeling of needing to work harder to keep these traditions alive because they're the only real connection you have, if you like, to your ancestry and to your heritage, because you're not living in the community that's eating, drinking, wearing clothes that were, typical of or resonate, aligned with what your ancestors wore, ate, drank, heard every single day. So it's your one strong way of keeping a link with your ancestry and your heritage. But at the same time, you don't fully understand what that link is. You're just kind of almost carrying it as a token without fully understanding how it is connected to you, which means that you can never fully align with it either, which then creates some distance for you. So moving on to looking into restoring dharma, I think a lot of the time when it comes to questioning traditions, it's not from a place of disrespect by any means or from a place of rejection. It's important to call into question traditions so that we can more deeply dive into where they come from, what the intentions were behind them when they were created, as far as we can discover that. Because for some traditions, it may be very hard to, but where we can find out what the origin, the root of that tradition was, we can then start to actively and consciously look at how we are upholding that tradition in this modern day world we live in, And by doing that, we can then look at whether we want to continue to uphold that tradition from a place of alignment, if it feels like it aligns with us, as many of these traditions actually do. Because for me, many of these traditions were actually about honoring the divine feminine force that resides within all women, that is essentially Ma Shakti, the primordial force of creation behind everything. So they are very empowering. They have very empowering origin stories, but many of these traditions are not upheld in that way anymore, from that viewpoint, from that state of consciousness anymore. So they are no longer honoring women in the way that they were designed to. So by questioning these traditions and looking back and criticizing what appears to be criticizing and judging them, what we're actually doing is inviting us to call into question how much what we're doing today is actually upholding the original reason for which this tradition came into being. And by doing that, we can then look to upholding that tradition in a more conscious way moving forwards, if we decide that it actually aligns with us. And that's what Mayani is about. Mayani is not about rejecting Indian traditions, Indian Jewelry traditions. It's not about rejecting where I come from. It's about deepening my understanding of where I come from, why these jewelry traditions exist, who they were created to honor, so that we can consciously decide whether they actually feel aligned to us and whether they feel like traditions we want to continue to pass on. Because I think we're at a time when many of us are awakening and coming to the realization that we no longer want to keep passing on traditions for the sake of passing on traditions. It has to be more meaningful than that. Because otherwise, essentially, it becomes so detached from us. It becomes no different to choosing what hairstyle you want to wear. Essentially, it becomes meaningless. It's just, do you want that hairstyle? Do you not? As opposed to, do you want that piece of bridal jewelry? Do you not? Instead of, that piece of bridal jewelry is particularly valuable and important. You're receiving it because of XYZ reason, which then really gives you an informed place from which to decide whether you wish to have that piece of bridal jewelry in your bridal wardrobe or not. So I leave you with the question today: when you are wearing your pieces of jewelry from your culture, from your heritage, your traditional pieces, are those pieces of jewelry being worn by you consciously, with full embrace of your divine power, with full awareness and embrace of who you are, with freedom to actually choose to wear those pieces? Um, or are you choosing to wear those pieces purely out of obligation, or because it's seen as something that's compulsory to do? I welcome you to share your thoughts. It has been a bit of a heavy one today, so we will look into each of these individually, because they're a little bit more, there's a lot more to discuss in each case. And I think perhaps a lot more questions and comments that may be received from all of you as well, because there is no right or wrong answer here. This is simply encouraging us to have a healthy debate about what these traditions existed for and whether we are actually honoring them now. And there are definitely families who are, but there are definitely families amongst which, as I mentioned for me, many people are unaware of them, and they may not even be being honored in the right way. Thank you for joining me as always. If you enjoy this content, please do hit the like button and feel free to hit the notification bell to see when my next video is out. Of course, I welcome you to subscribe as well. And please, please, please feel free to share any questions or comments you have below. I'll be back again soon. And remember, because your jewelry should always be more than just an afterthought. Bye for now.